We Unitarian Universalists do not spend a lot of time talking about heaven anymore. It used to be a significant talking point historically as we distinguished ourselves from other Protestant Christian denominations a few hundred years ago. We talked about heaven and how to get into heaven quite a bit. The early American Universalists spoke about God's love and how we are all God's children and all of us will be reunited with God in heaven in the end. The early Unitarians spoke of how our deeds and actions were the measure to determine if we were good people and that as good people we would receive our reward in heaven. Modern Unitarian Universalists live together in a pluralistic faith with a range of beliefs and practices. The central doctrines of the past are not as important as to our identity as they once were. We gather around shared values more than common beliefs today. I contend, however, that our various beliefs and values still point strongly toward an idea like heaven, an idea like love. I would talk more about love today, but allow me to linger for a moment on the topic of heaven as we begin. We all have some ideas about heaven, ideas that we may or may not believe in anymore, but we recognize them all the same. So what is heaven? Setting aside the pastoral aspect of that question for a moment, consider this from a metaphysical framework. What does the concept call to mind for you? Maybe you think of heaven as a place. Perhaps the cartoons of people standing on clouds is the image that you conjure in your mind. Or maybe you're a traditionalist and think of heaven as a garden, or a kingdom, or a city on a hill. It's possible you think not of a place or a location at all. Perhaps you imagine heaven as an activity. Perhaps heaven is about playing a harp, or being at rest, or being free from suffering at least. Is that what comes to mind for you when someone says the word heaven? Maybe the idea of heaven is less specific for you. Maybe it's not a place or an activity so much as a sense of reward for being good, of being saved. That is certainly in keeping with how people speak about heaven as a motivation to behave ethically in this life. Or consider the way people speak of seeing loved ones in heaven, or how loved ones are looking down on us from heaven. This imagines heaven as a relationship more than as a location, although location does get tangled up in it, doesn't it? But it's more of a place that has people, specific relationships in it, loved ones, or perhaps a place to be with God. What is heaven? There are differing answers to that question, and as I said, we are a pluralistic tradition now. There isn't one answer that you are expected to nod and assent when you hear. However you think of it, whether you believe in heaven or not, as a place or a relationship, as rest or reward, you certainly have some concept in your mind when you think of the word. I suggest, while we Unitarian Universalists do not spend a lot of time talking about heaven anymore, we do spend quite a bit of time talking about something similar. We talk about being good people and helping to make the world a better place. And there is a direct connection between those topics. A few years back, there was a television show about heaven. Allow me to digress for a moment. I found this television show quite interesting. It was the talk of my colleagues' circles for quite a bit. It was called The Good Place. It's a 4-season show on one of the streaming online channels. It's funny, it's clever, it's certainly irreverent, and yet it turns poignant and even profound. If you haven't watched it, I do recommend it. The premise is this: Eleanor Shellstrop, played by Kristen Bell, is welcomed after her death to the good place, a highly selective, heaven-like utopia designed and run by an afterlife architect named Michael as a reward for her righteous life. She realizes, right there in the first episode, however, that she was sent there by mistake and must hide her morally imperfect past behavior while trying to become a better, more ethical person. So early on in that first episode, Eleanor asks, who was right about the afterlife? Have any of you ever thought that that's what you would do, that you would have something like a first question when you got to heaven and asked, well, who was right? Michael, the architect, answers her saying, well, Hindus were a little bit right, Muslims a little bit, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist ideas. Every religion guessed about 5%. More interestingly, the show highlights moral philosophy while still being entertaining. The show talks about Aristotle and Kant, Kierkegaard, without watering them down. Really, the show is about ethics and how to be a better person. Ultimately, it's a depiction of the afterlife as a place of learning and growth. One of my favorite quotes from the show is this: what matters isn't if people are good or bad. What matters is if they're trying to be better today than they were yesterday. That's pretty good. I love it when a conversation about heaven and the afterlife circles around to ethics and how we can be better to one another and that we can become better people in this life. I love that a conversation about heaven can lead us to a conversation about how we can make a heaven of this life that we are living even today. That's the heart of what I'm lifting up this morning. The image of heaven that we evoke today is one of a community rooted in love and justice for all. Our contemporary Unitarian Universalism reveals a theological challenge for us to live our values of love and inclusion, that heaven is in our hands. As poet June Jordan once said, we are the ones we've been waiting for. 2 weeks back, a member of our congregation, Ruth Blizzard, delivered a sermon. And she reminded us many churches today still reject persons of color, require women to submit to men, believe homosexuality is a sin, and contend that only those who believe exactly as they do will be saved. Our tradition of universal salvation offers hope, acceptance, and sanctuary to those doomed by other religions. She went on to clarify key points in our history which have led us to become who we are today, a justice-seeking religion of inclusion for all. Then 1 week ago, we heard a sermon from my colleague, Reverend Craig Schwallenberg. He asked us about the evidence that we are living by these values and beliefs we espouse. He asked how people would know that we are Unitarian Universalists by our actions. What is the evidence? Today, I notice a clear line from our historical theology of heaven into our contemporary mission to live our values in this world. We are trying to make this life rich and rewarding. We are working to build a just and compassionate society today to manifest our heaven right here. We're still a pluralistic community. We still have multiple answers to the question, what is heaven? And we are trying to build it together now. Of course, It's hard to build anything at the moment. We're living in this long, slow return from the pandemic disruption. Our society is simultaneously post-pandemic and still smack in the midst of the impact. We are picking up some pieces of our old normal, and yet hundreds of people still die every day in our country from COVID-19. This is exhausting. And we are working to manifest our heaven together in the midst of this mess. The image that we put out there, our version of heaven, is one of inclusion, of justice, of care. As such, over these past 2 pandemic years, we have sought that balance between keeping people safe and staying in touch with each other, of protecting the most vulnerable among us and also resisting the deadening impact of isolation. But that's just the point. We're not waiting to receive a reward, to have a final rest when life is done. We're in it already. That's how it works. There's a line from Thoreau's Walden in which he writes, "Heaven is under our feet as well as over our heads." Or, as I've stated in my sermon title, in our hands. It is always happening, and it will keep happening over and over, around us, within us, among us, ever unfolding anew in each moment. It's not an ending. That's one of the interesting pieces that we offer. We don't imagine heaven as an ending. It's now. Or as Peter Mayer sings, everything is holy now. Over the past few months, a handful of us have been in a UU theology class together, reading and discussing the book A House of Hope by John Behrens and Rebecca Parker. This has been a multi-congregational offering co-led by myself, Reverend Darcy Lane of the Athens and Cortland UU congregations, and Reverend Joe Von Rue of May Memorial UU in Syracuse. I mention this class for 2 reasons. First, it's an example of what I'm talking about. Not that this class is an example of heaven. Nothing so grand. Instead, it's a small example of the community that we are creating. One not confined by the usual limits, in this case, the usual limits of one minister teaches to the one congregation. We threw away that limit. The second reason is that the text we used offered a chapter about what I'm talking about this morning. In the very first chapter, Rebecca Parker wrote about, she calls it eschatology. One of the interesting things of the book is that it brings up all these old, beautiful theological words. Eschatology is that aspect of traditional Christian theology in which we find the topic of heaven. And Rebecca Parker writes this: radically realized eschatology begins with affirming that we are already standing on holy ground. This earth, and none other, is a garden of beauty, a place of life. Our religious framework can shift from hope for what could be to hope that what is good will be treated with justice and love, and that what has been harmed will be repaired. That is a vision of making this world, this life, heaven. So I say we are in it now. As Parker says, we are already standing on holy ground. As Peter Mayer sang, everything is holy now. Even with this pandemic confounding our living, even with war and oppression, injustice, and destruction plaguing our days, still we can bring love and hope with us into every situation. Still, we can make this time and this place a little more like heaven, because that is what we do. We are the ones. We are the ones. We are the ones we've been waiting. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the ones we've been waiting for. The vision we put out there, our version of heaven, is one of inclusion, of justice, and of care for all. We have heaven here in our hands, at our feet, in our hearts, and in our minds. We can make this place even better. Even now it already is, and with a little effort on our part, it yet can be. In a world without end, may it be so.